Hi folks, welcome to our next video with the focus on ratios. You will have to know ratios for the exam. For the most part, they'll be tested through multiple choice, but you may have the opportunity to do some calculations of them as you're working through problems or even have some problems dedicated to them. So it's a good idea to talk to your instructor so you know how you'll be tested. Here's a question on ratios. And this information has been taken from the statements of Berger for the years ending 2019 and 2018. And we need you to tell us whether or not the change in the ratio is favorable or unfavorable to the company. So what you have to think about here is if the ratio is increasing or decreasing, is that better or worse? If it's better, it's favorable. If it's worse, then it's unfavorable, meaning that you have to know what the ratio means and how to calculate it in order to answer the question. So now, what you will be given on the exam, these are the ratios you'll be given on the exam. Okay, so this is exactly how it will look. You'll get a current ratio and a formula, but you're not going to be told what it means. That's what you have to know. So you'll be given a whole series of ratios with the formulas. So even in this question, you don't have to calculate it, but what we find is that sometimes it helps students to see the formula because they can look at the formula and remember through interpretation of the formula what it means. So in our case, if we look at our question, the receivables turnover will tell us how much we're collecting in receivables in cash throughout the year, right? How many times are we collecting? Well, we were collecting 8.4, or say on average 8 times a year, if we round it to the nearest whole time. Now we're only collecting approximately 7.2 times, or say to round it 7 times a year. Well, the more frequently we collect, it's better, right? But we're not collecting as much in 2019 as we did in 2018, so that's unfavorable, right? And you can see by the ratio, right? Average net receivables based on credit sales revenue. So how often are you turning over those receivables that you recorded as sales revenue? Okay, so that means that in our case, because the number's getting smaller, you're not collecting as many times during the year, so that's unfavorable. Your asset turnover, that's a measure of efficiency of your assets to help you generate revenue. If you look at the formula, you can see that. For all of our assets that we have, on average, how much sales revenue do they help us generate? So in our question, bigger is better. In 2018, we were generating 3.2 times in revenue the balance of our average total assets. Now we're only generating 2.25 times the amount of revenue for the average assets we have. So that's lower. So we're not generating as much sales revenue as we were this year. We're not generating as much sales revenue this year as we were last year from our average total assets. So that's unfavorable. And don't forget, hint, bigger is better except for that debt to asset ratio. All right, now here we are at the debt to asset ratio. Debt to asset ratio is a measure of solvency. It measures solvency. So in our case, we want to know on a long-term basis how solvent is our company. All right, so we're going to look at total debt to total assets. So that formula here is total liabilities to total assets. So we want to make sure we're generating enough assets to clear off all of our liabilities, current and non-current. Well, you can see here that if we had more assets than we did liabilities, that would be better. So the smaller, the better here. So if we increase the denominator, that makes the whole fraction smaller. But if our liabilities are way bigger than our assets, that makes the ratio bigger, and that means we're not going to have enough assets to clear off all of our liabilities. So now we have to think, in this case, Smaller is better. Remember, bigger is better except for the debt to asset ratio. So what do we have? Well, it was 0.90. So that means we had 0.90. So we had total assets. If you look at your formula, right, we must have had total liabilities, which were less than total assets. So this ratio was 90%. So it means if it's greater than 1, it's not so good, right? But the smaller it is, the better, and it's less than 1. So for every $10 in total assets, we had $9 in liabilities. So if it's below 1, the smaller the better, that's okay. That's not bad. But is it an improvement? Okay, this year, well, it's 0.85. So that means that our liabilities are less than our assets, in an even better position. So if you look at your formula, that means for every, say, $10 in assets, you only have $8.50 in liabilities, right? You have less liabilities for the same number of assets. So in our case, we would say that's favorable because as it gets smaller, it's better. Now, if you look at the current ratio, that tells us on a short-term basis how solvent we are on a short-term basis. So do we have enough current assets to cover our current liabilities? So if we have a look at our formula, you can see our current ratio looks at current assets to current liabilities. So the bigger this ratio is, the better. Why? Because that means our assets get bigger than our liabilities, which is what we want. But we're talking about a current ratio, so we're looking at current assets divided by current liabilities. So the more current assets we have to cover those current liabilities, the better. So in our question, is it getting bigger? Well, in 2018, it was 1.75. In 2019, it's 1.5. So it's unfavorable. It's getting smaller. Inventory turnover tells us how many times during the year we turn over or sell our inventory. Well, guess what? It took us we did 6.2 times we sold it. Here we're doing 6.9 times this year. That's better, right? It's bigger, so it's better. Here we were selling our inventory 6.2 times a year. The more times we sell it, the more chance we have to collect money from customers, right? Because when we sell, the customer has to pay us. So in this case, we're collecting 6.2 times a year. In 2018, now we're collecting slightly more, 6.9 times in 2019. So that's favorable. All right, so remember, bigger is better except for the debt to asset ratio, and we have a debt to asset ratio, but all these guys here, A, B, D, and E, bigger is better. This guy, debt to asset, smaller is better. So that concludes this question on ratios.